Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Earthly Delights, where we dig into the soil, the seasons, and the forgotten wisdom hidden in the plants around us. You know what still gets me, even after years of growing food and working the land? That moment in late summer when you step into the garden and feel like you did everything right. You fed the soil with good compost. You spaced your plants carefully. You watered deeply. You paid attention. And yet somehow the weather still turns on you. Pests still show up overnight, and the crops you work so hard to protect still act like they're one bad week away from collapsing. If you're someone who grows in a backyard, tends a few raised beds, worries over yellowing leaves, battles heat stress, fights mildew, or tries to make tired soil productive again, then you already know this feeling. So many of the plants we love are surprisingly delicate. Tomatoes need support, shade, and constant watching. Cucumbers can struggle the moment humidity shifts. Peppers stall, lettuce bolts, and sometimes it feels like we spend more time rescuing plants than actually enjoying them. But then you come across a tree that seems to break all the rules. A tree that doesn't just survive hard conditions, but pushes through them with strength. A tree that can grow fast in poor soil, handle punishing heat, ask for very little water, and still give you edible leaves, peace, flowers, and roots. A tree so packed with value that scientists have called it one of the most useful trees on Earth. And that brings us to the question that stopped me in my tracks. If this tree is really that extraordinary, why isn't it growing in every backyard, every nursery, and every community garden? Why have so many home growers barely heard of it? Today, we're talking about Moringa oleifera, and by the end of this video, I think you'll see not only this plant differently, but the whole modern food system differently too. If you love practical growing knowledge, resilient plants, and the kind of garden wisdom that actually changes how you plant, make sure you subscribe to Earthly Delights. Let's begin. Part 1. The miracle in the soil. What exactly is Moringa? To really understand why Moringa has earned such an almost mythical reputation, we need to start where every good grower starts, at the roots. Moringa oleifera is believed to have originated in the sub-Himalayan regions of northern India, but over generations is spread far beyond that birthplace, establishing itself across tropical and subtropical regions in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. In different places, people came to know it by different names. Some call it the drumstick tree because of its long, narrow seed pods. Others call it the horseradish tree because the roots carry a sharp, peppery bite. But one of the most revealing names came out of Africa, where this tree proved itself in heat, drought, and poor ground. There, in some regions, it became known as the never-die tree. And honestly, when you look at how it grows, that name makes perfect sense. Moringa is what botanists describe as a pioneer species. In plain language, that means it is one of the first plants capable of moving into damaged, depleted, or hostile land and still making a life there. It does not wait for perfect conditions. It begins where other plants give up. A big part of that resilience comes from its root system. Moringa sends down a strong, deep taproot that works like an anchor and a lifeline, at the same time reaching for moisture far below the surface. And if you've spent any time growing vegetables, you immediately understand how extraordinary that is. When drought settles in, lettuce bolts, beans slow down, and peppers can begin to fade. But Moringa responds differently. In punishing heat and dry weather, it can keep pushing out fresh growth. Its leaves are built to conserve water while still capturing enough sunlight to fuel rapid development, even in full, harsh sun. And rapid really is the word here. In its first year, Moringa can shoot up to around 16 feet under the right conditions and begin producing flowers and pods far sooner than most people would expect from a tree. That kind of speed changes the way you think about what a productive plant can be. It feels less like a fragile crop and more like a survival system written directly into nature. What I find especially fascinating, as someone who has spent years working with soil and watching what thrives where, is that Moringa does not demand luxury. It is not asking for rich black garden loam and endless pampering. Give it neutral to slightly acidic soil, good drainage, and a sandy or loamy structure, and it is often far more comfortable than many of the plants we fuss over all season. This is a tree for edges, dry places, neglected corners, and land that has been written off. And yet, what it gives back from those hard conditions is exactly what makes its story so remarkable. Part 2. The Nutritional Powerhouse, Leaves of Life. And this is where the story of Moringa goes from impressive to almost unbelievable. If you were trying to design the ideal plant-based nutritional supplement from scratch, you would probably want strong mineral content, valuable vitamins, antioxidant power, and some real protein behind it. Moringa delivers all of that in a way that hardly seems real the first time you study it closely. The leaves are where much of that value lives. Gram for gram, dried moringa leaves are often described as containing far more vitamin C than oranges, more calcium than milk, more vitamin A than carrots, more potassium than bananas, and dramatically more iron than spinach. On top of that, moringa is known for containing all 9 essential amino acids, which is one of the reasons it has drawn so much attention as a plant-based protein source. For gardeners, homesteaders, and anyone trying to grow food with real nutritional depth, that alone is enough to stop you in your tracks. But this is also the point where people often lose some of that value without realizing it. I've seen it happen many times with growers who are excited to harvest their first leaves. The instinct is to treat them like any other leafy green. Pick them, boil them, and serve them down like spinach. And yes, that is one traditional way they are used. But if your goal is to preserve as much nutrition as possible, especially the more delicate components, that method comes with a cost. Heat can reduce vitamin C, and it can take away some of the more fragile raw qualities that make the leaf so special in the first place. The better approach, especially if you want to store moringa and use it through the colder months, is drying. But here is the part many people get wrong. You do not dry moringa in direct sun. That sounds backwards to a lot of home growers because we are used to hanging herbs in bright windows or laying them where light can reach them. With moringa, strong sun works against you. Too much UV exposure can strip away color, damage beta-carotene, and leave the leaves faded and nutritionally diminished. What you want instead is shade, warmth, and airflow. Bundle the branches and hang them in a dark, ventilated room where they can dry slowly without being bleached by sunlight. After a few days, the leaves should become crisp while still holding that deep, rich green color that tells you much of the goodness is still intact. Then you can strip them from the stems, crush them into a fine powder, and store them for later use. And that single decision, shade drying instead of sun drying, makes a real difference. It is the difference between preserving a true food resource and ending up with a jar that looks healthy but has lost much of what made it valuable. Done properly, that powder becomes one of the simplest ways to carry the strength of the growing season into the middle of winter. Stir it into oatmeal, blend it into smoothies, or add it to everyday meals. And suddenly this fast-growing tree becomes more than something interesting in the garden. It becomes a dependable source of nutrition you can actually live with. Part 3. The logistics paradox. Why haven't we heard of it? Now, this is the part of the story where things get a little uncomfortable because the question becomes harder to ignore. If a tree really offers this much, complete protein, exceptional nutrient density, resilience in drought, and the ability to thrive where other crops fail, then why is it still missing from so many nurseries, seed catalogs, and grocery stores? Why haven't most people ever seen fresh moringa stacked in the produce aisle? I remember asking myself the same thing. If researchers were willing to describe this as one of the most useful trees on Earth, surely it would have found its way into everyday gardening culture by now. And then the answer became clear. Agriculture, especially modern agriculture, does not always reward the most nourishing plant or the most resilient plant. More often, it rewards the plant that can survive transport, storage, packaging, and sale. That pattern shows up all over the food system. Think about the supermarket tomato for a moment. Most commercial tomatoes were not selected because they tasted better or offered more nutrition. They were selected because they could handle long-distance shipping, refrigeration, stacking, and time on a shelf without collapsing. They were bred for endurance and commerce. Fresh moringa fails that test almost immediately. Its leaves are delicate. Once harvested, they begin to wilt, soften, and lose quality very quickly. You cannot harvest fresh moringa, seal it in a plastic container, ship it across the country, and expect it to look market-ready days later. It simply does not behave like a crop built for industrial distribution. And that single weakness explains a great deal. So the reason most people have not heard of fresh moringa is not that it lacks value, quite the opposite. It was sidelined because it does not fit neatly into the machinery of large-scale retail. We built a food system that favors products that travel well, last long, and sell predictably, even if that means choosing shelf life over nutritional power. And there is another layer to that. A plant that grows fast, asks for little, and gives people a steady source of nutrition close to home is not nearly as profitable as something that has to be purchased again and again through a long supply chain. Yes, moringa has now found a place in the marketplace as powder, capsules, and premium wellness products. But as a living plant in the everyday home garden, it never became a mainstream staple because it failed the logistics test. And for anyone trying to build real food independence at home, that is a lesson worth sitting with. The plants that dominate the market are not always the plants that serve people best. Sometimes the most important crops are the ones the system had no easy way to package. Part 4, the ultimate survival tool, water purification. And just when you think moringa's story could not become more astonishing, it does. The leaves are impressive. The growth rate is remarkable. The drought tolerance alone would make it worth attention. But the feature that truly pushed moringa into another category altogether is not the food. It is the water. Once the tree matures, it produces long pods filled with seeds. And those seeds carry one of the most extraordinary natural functions I have ever come across in any useful plant. When mature moringa seeds are dried, crushed into a powder, and stirred into dirty, cloudy, bacteria-heavy water, they begin to do something that feels almost impossible the first time you see it. The seed powder contains naturally occurring cationic proteins, often referred to as Moringa Oleifera cationic protein, or MOCP. These proteins act as a natural coagulant. In simple terms, many of the impurities suspended in dirty water, including fine particles and certain bacteria, carry a negative electrical charge. The proteins from the moringa seed carry a positive charge, so they bind to those impurities, pull them together, and form larger clumps known as flocks. Those flocks become heavy enough to sink to the bottom. The result can be dramatic. Water that starts off murky and brown can become visibly clear within a relatively short period of time. Research from universities and environmental groups has shown that crushed moringa seeds can remove a very high percentage of bacteria and suspended impurities from untreated water. Even more striking, newer studies suggest that prepared seed extracts may also help remove microplastics, performing in ways that invite comparison with chemical coagulants like aluminum sulfate, but without the same residue concerns. The first time I read through reports on this process, I had the same reaction many growers do when they encounter a truly useful plant for the first time: disbelief, followed by a kind of stunned respect. One tree can feed you, handle dry conditions, and help clean the water you depend on. That moves moringa far beyond the category of an interesting garden plant. For communities with limited infrastructure, that kind of natural water treatment is not just clever, it can be life-changing. In places where clean water is hard to access, a tree like this becomes part of survival itself, standing quietly at the edge of a field or village and offering a service that entire industries have been built to provide through chemicals and machinery. And once you understand that, you begin to see moringa not just as a crop, but as a complete support system rooted in the living world. Part 5. From ancient Ayurveda to modern wellness. But moringa's story does not end with drought tolerance, nutrition, or even water purification. What makes this tree even more remarkable is that its usefulness was understood long before modern wellness culture ever discovered it. Its medicinal and cultural history runs deep. In Ayurveda, the traditional system of medicine that has been practiced in India for thousands of years, moringa is known as shigru and has long been valued for helping restore balance in the body. Ancient writings describe it with almost legendary respect, crediting it with uses across a vast range of conditions. And India was not alone in recognizing its value. The Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians also made use of moringa, especially the rich oil pressed from its seeds. That oil, often called ben oil, was prized in perfumes, skin preparations, and ceremonial use. It was valued not just because it felt luxurious, but because it was remarkably stable. Rich in behenic and oleic acids, it moisturizes deeply and can remain usable for years without turning rancid, which is a rare quality in a natural oil. What I find especially compelling is how modern science is now beginning to confirm what traditional cultures seem to understand intuitively. Moringa leaves contain a wide range of bioactive compounds, including antioxidants such as quercetin and chlorogenic acid, both of which are associated with reducing oxidative stress and helping the body manage inflammation. Research has also explored its potential role in supporting blood sugar balance, cardiovascular function, and broader metabolic health. And in a world where so many people are overcaffeinated, undernourished, and constantly overstimulated, that matters. Many people who use moringa regularly describe its effect not as a spike, but as a steadier kind of energy, something more nourishing and grounded, without the sharp rise and crash that comes with stimulants. Of course, it is not some instant miracle product, no matter what flashy marketing might promise. It is not a shortcut. It is something much more useful than that. Moringa works more like a foundational food, one that supports the body gently and consistently. It helps rebuild from underneath. It gives nourishment in a form the body can actually use. And in that way, it feels like a meeting point between ancient plant wisdom and modern nutritional understanding. A quiet reminder that some of the best tools for vitality were here long before we started packaging health in bottles. Part 6, Growing the Miracle in Your Own Backyard, Practical Tips. Now at this point, I know what some of you are probably thinking. This all sounds incredible, but what if you do not live in a tropical climate? What if your winters are real winters, with frost, frozen ground, and a growing season that feels far too short for something like this? That hesitation is understandable, and I had the same thought myself when I first looked seriously at moringa. It is true that moringa is only reliably hardy outdoors in warmer regions, especially zones 9 through 11. Freezing temperatures will knock it back hard and can kill it to the roots. But experienced growers learn over time that climate limits are not always dead ends. Very often, they are just design problems waiting for the right approach. And the trick with moringa in cooler climates is simple. Do not think of it as a permanent tree. Think of it as a fast-growing, seasonal crop. In other words, grow it the way you would grow tomatoes, peppers, or other warm season plants that make the most of summer. Start the seeds indoors about 6 weeks before your last expected frost. The seeds are large and easy enough for them to handle, with those distinctive papery wings that make them easy to recognize. Soaking them overnight can help wake them up. And once you plant them, give them deep containers because moringa sends down a taproot very quickly. That early root development is one of the reasons it establishes so fast once conditions are right. When the weather fully warms and the soil has real heat in it, transplant the seedlings outside. Give them full sun, and I mean true full sun, the hottest, driest, brightest part of the yard, the kind of place where softer crops would struggle. But there is one condition you absolutely cannot compromise on: drainage. Moringa may be drought tolerant, but it does not tolerate soggy roots. Wet, heavy soil can destroy the plant faster than drought ever will. If you are growing it in pots, use a mix that drains freely and does not stay waterlogged after rain or watering. And if you want to keep it going beyond one season, containers make that easier. Before the first frost in autumn, move the plant indoors to a bright, sunny space, then bring it back outside once warm weather returns. And if your goal is leaf production, there is one more technique that makes a huge difference: pruning. When the plant reaches around 3 to 4 feet tall, cut the main stem back. I know that sounds harsh, especially after caring for it so closely, but moringa responds beautifully to that kind of treatment. Once the central leader is cut, it sends out side branches and turns into a fuller, bushier plant. Instead of becoming a tall, awkward stem, it becomes a compact source of repeated leaf harvests. And from there, you can keep harvesting steadily right up until the season turns. Part 7, Beyond the Garden, Climate and Global Impact. But now I want to widen the frame, because moringa's value does not stop at the edge of a backyard bed or a homestead fence. This tree matters on a much larger scale. We are living through a time shaped by climate pressure, exhausted soils, unstable food systems, and growing water stress. And when you look at moringa through that lens, it starts to feel less like a useful plant and more like a working model for the kind of agriculture the future may actually need. One of the most striking things about moringa is how efficiently it captures carbon. Some estimates suggest its rate of carbon dioxide assimilation is dramatically higher than that of general vegetation, which helps explain why it has drawn interest not only from growers, but from researchers thinking about restoration and climate response. There are even projections showing that if moringa cultivation expanded on a much larger scale, its total carbon sequestering potential could be enormous. In a world searching for practical tools to rebuild damaged landscapes, that is not a small thing. Its role in farming systems is just as impressive. When moringa leaves are used as feed for livestock, such as cattle, sheep, and goats, studies have shown benefits that go beyond simple nutrition. Animals can gain weight more efficiently, milk production can improve, and methane emissions from the rumen may decline as well. That means one tree can support animal productivity while also helping reduce one of agriculture's most serious greenhouse gas problems. Very few plants can make that kind of claim. And it doesn't stop there. Fresh moringa leaf extract contains natural growth-promoting compounds, including zeatin, which means it can also be used as a foliar spray to support the productivity of other crops. In some trials, plants like corn, soybeans, and coffee have shown meaningful yield increases when treated with it. So moringa is not just feeding people and animals directly, it can also strengthen the performance of the broader farm system around it. Then there is the humanitarian side, which may be the most important of all. In regions facing severe malnutrition, moringa has been used as a practical nutritional resource for vulnerable communities, including nursing mothers and children who need concentrated nourishment the most. And when you place that alongside everything else we have already talked about, food, resilience, water purification, livestock support, carbon capture, you begin to understand the real scale of what this plant represents. This is not just another interesting species to add to a list of useful trees. It is an agricultural system in miniature, packed into a single seed. It grows where conditions are hard, restores value where land has been neglected, supports life where resources are thin, and reminds us that some of the smartest solutions on Earth have been standing quietly in plain sight the whole time. Conclusion: what else are we ignoring? And maybe that is the thought I want to leave you with. So much of modern gardening feels like a struggle. We battle pests, drag hoses through dry weather, pull weeds, protect tender plants, and spend entire seasons trying to force fragile crops through conditions they were never built to handle. We often approach the garden like a fight, as if success only comes from controlling more, spraying more, correcting more. But the people who lived closely with plants for generations often worked from a different kind of wisdom. They paid attention to which plants already knew how to live well. That is what makes moringa so powerful as an idea, not just as a tree. Once you see how a plant this useful was pushed to the margins simply because it does not fit neatly into a modern supply chain, it changes the way you look at the entire system. You begin to realize that the produce aisle is not the final word on what matters. Convenience is not the same thing as value. Shelf life is not the same thing as nourishment. And what our markets reward is not always what our gardens, our bodies, or our communities need most. The deeper lesson here is bigger than moringa itself. This is just one tree from one category of landscapes, one example among thousands of plants that traditional growers and cultures understood long before industrial agriculture narrowed the field. So if a tree that can feed people, support health, tolerate drought, and help purify water could be overlooked so completely, then it is worth asking a much larger question. What else have we dismissed? What other plants, methods, and old forms of land wisdom are we walking past simply because they do not come packaged, branded, and ready for a shelf? If this story changed the way you think about what belongs in a garden, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever grown moringa or another tough, generous pioneer plant like it? Have you ever reached that point of frustration with delicate vegetables and started wondering whether there was a better way to grow? Those are exactly the questions that keep this channel alive. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Earthly Delights. Keep planting, keep learning from the land, and keep questioning the systems that taught us what to value. I'll see you in the next one.